Yo, what's going on, Jungle Cats? Gatos here, coming at you with a new video. We're going to be talking about deck building in this video, but I just kind of wanted to intro some things because I feel like this video relates very heavily to the rest of my content. In this video, we're going to be looking at some deck building tricks for unique decks. To me, I really enjoy deck building. I'm not like someone that gets super into the meta decks. I do like to look at what's going on in the meta and understanding what people are playing. And I think it is kind of helpful to have a heads up about what I should be looking out for when I'm playing people. But for me, I really enjoy the deck building in this game. I like trying out new cards. I'm not super into the competitive scene. I do occasionally participate in that. So I just wanted to mention that because a lot of my videos are focused on unique decks. I like making decks that more people can play. I know that a lot of people don't spend a lot of money on this game, so they might not get the EX cards right away. And I feel like people can get a little bit discouraged if they don't have the top of the line cards. So I personally like focusing on utilizing maybe not some of the EX cards, but some of the less rare cards that are easier for people to pick up. Without further ado, we're going to jump into the video and those tips. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. So comment down below. It definitely helps the video out a lot. Also, I am recording this before the mini set is releasing. I'm going to try to get a video out with the deck. We'll have to see kind of like how it works out, but I am traveling right now. So yeah, it's going to depend on when I get back and such. But besides that, let's jump into the video. All right, so here we are in Pocket, and I'm just going to go through a couple of tips, and then we're going to walk through the majority of the tips while we're actually putting together a deck. I think it's just going to be kind of helpful to show you my process as we walk through it, and we'll like make a new deck in the process. I don't know if it's going to be that good, but we'll see how it goes. One thing I just wanted to mention before we get into the nitty gritty, I'm going to have timestamps down below that kind of encapsulate the main idea of each section, but deck building is very specific. And it really depends on what Pokemon you're trying to run with. I can't really go over every single detail. I'm just trying to give you an idea of some things to think about. And hopefully that'll help give some ideas for how you can handle similar process with a card that you want to play with. But yeah, there's a couple of things I wanted to go through before we start putting the deck together. But the first tip I wanted to talk about is Pokemon to item ratio. So we'll just kind of go into one of my decks as an example. Typically when I'm building a deck, I try to aim for 8 to 12 Pokemon and vice versa for items. So like 12 to 8, depending on how many Pokemon are in the deck. Generally, I don't stray too much from this unless I'm using an EX Pokemon that's pretty powerful. Then I might have a few less Pokemon in the deck, but it really depends on the Pokemon that you're building the deck for. Since I typically don't build a lot of EX Pokemon decks, I'm averaging around like 8 to 12 Pokemon spots, and then vice versa with the items, like I mentioned. But I think there are a lot of EX decks like Articuno or Executor, Celebi, those type of decks that have powerful Pokemon that can kind of carry and be supported by items. They're going to end up on the lower side of the Pokemon. But most of the decks that are kind of unique, I feel like end up around like 8 to 12 Pokemon. Usually 12 is pushing it. Usually like 11 is where I try to cap it out at. And if I'm having a lot of Pokemon in my deck, then I'm definitely thinking about adding some Pokemon communication tools in there. Another thing I like to think about with Pokemon is the ratio that I have of their stages. So I'm kind of like a math guy, and percentages are huge for me in this game. I'm always kind of thinking about the percentages. I know if I'm trying to draw a Pokemon early, I need to have more of that Pokemon in the deck. And if I don't want to draw a Pokemon early, if they're kind of like a weaker base Pokemon and build up to a stronger stage 2 Pokemon, then I might have less. So just as an example, in my Inclement Weather deck, I really wanted to draw Starly early. So I put 2 Starly in this deck. And that kind of worked with Starly because it has a unique ability that can help early game. But Froakie's pretty weak, so I only put 1 Froakie in here. If Froakie was a stronger Pokemon, I might have put 2 Froakie in here. But with the Greninja line, I'm really just trying to build up to Greninja, so I want to have that line in the back line. So yeah, it might seem kind of obvious, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're deck building is the amount of Pokemon you have in the deck is really important. I think this idea really developed early in the competitive scene with Arcanine decks. People were only putting 1 Growlithe in the deck and 2 Arcanine. And the reason they were doing that was because they wanted to draw their Moltres early and decrease the chances of drawing their Growlithe. Arcanine's like a powerful Pokemon, so you want to build that up in the background and have it come out when it's ready. So yeah, that's kind of the main things I wanted to go over before. Just get those in the back of your mind, and we'll jump into building a deck right now and go through some more tips. All right, so let's jump into building a deck. So when I'm building a deck, I generally try to find one Pokemon that I want to focus on and kind of build the deck around them and cater the rest of the cards to their strengths and their weaknesses. So I did a little bit thinking about this. There isn't a lot of cards that I haven't tried out, but I haven't used Drifloon and Drifloon that much. And I actually think they're a pretty decent stat line. So let's make a deck around them. We'll see how it goes. It's probably not going to be the best deck in the world, but I'm sure it will be okay. So generally, I'll look at the strengths and the weaknesses of Pokemon and kind of choose them based on those. And I'll kind of have an idea of what they need to support them in this specific deck. So if we look at Drifloon, I think this is a great starting Pokemon. It is a little bit weak with only 50 HP, so that's something we have to keep in mind. But it does help block 20 damage up front, which is really good, and it still puts on 10 damage. So I think that's kind of a unique ability. There's not a lot of Pokemon that block and do damage. So I think this is a pretty good starting Pokemon, and I think we can build off of it. Now, since we do have the minus 20 damage being blocked, that is kind of helpful for the low HP. It might allow us to not require a cape for this Pokemon. And then just looking at Drifloon, this Drifloon has decent HP, 100 HP is pretty good. It's going to be able to survive a good amount of attacks for at least 2 hits. And it's putting down 60 damage, which is also pretty good. We also have the electric weakness, so just keep that in mind when we come up against electric decks. This is pretty helpful paired with other psychic Pokemon. Most psychic Pokemon have a weakness to darkness energy, so this is a little bit unique, which can be helpful for us and can give us a little bit more variety and act as a pretty good shield against those darkness types. And then we only have 1 retreat cost, so I don't think we would really need like an X speed or a leaf in this deck. I think we would be fine just retreating out here, and then we could easily just throw this back in if we need to. I think like the Stardust stage 1 Pokemon are ones that only need 1 energy, just because they're a great tool to have if you go first, because you can evolve your Pokemon and attack that turn, which is a huge benefit. And most people hate going first, so I think it's important to keep in mind, like, how can I get an advantage even if I am going first? Or how can I build my deck to sort of benefit me or start laying down damage? With stage 1 Pokemon that require 2 energy, you typically want to go second. So if you go first, you can be falling behind a little bit. And you just want to think about, what can I do to come back from that? So maybe a Rocky Helmet would be good in this deck in order to help keep the momentum going. Another thing to keep in mind is focusing on the energy and how much energy this Pokemon requires. So this requiring 2 is not requiring that much energy. So we could potentially pair it with something that requires a little higher energy, has a stronger attack that we can build up in the background while this holds off for a little bit in the front lines. If you are working with a Pokemon with mixed energy or with more colorless energy, that's just something to keep in mind. Maybe I could play this in a mixed energy deck. Maybe I could play this with another type of Pokemon. And yeah, generally, I think it's really important to look at every single detail on the card that your Pokemon has and really understand it. So with all that in mind about Drifloon and Drifloon, I would say that it's a pretty good card. It's good for starting out the game, but you really need some power to come in behind it. And as we get into this, I think we can jump into the next section, which is thinking about the goals of our deck. So what we know is that Drifloon can start off for us strong and take out maybe a Pokemon for us. I think we can use the Pokemon like Mesprit to help clean up in the end and finish up the game and build it up in the background. I also think this could work well with Drifloon just because we could leave Drifloon in, sacrifice it, and have some spots open up for our Azelf and our Uxie. So there'd be a lot of room on the board. We'd put down some damage, maybe take out one of their Pokemon and be able to clean up with Mesprit, which would take out like an EX Pokemon in one shot. So yeah, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add these in the deck. And now that we have all the Pokemon to decide on, we can think about the ratios a little bit more and think about what items are going to help support these Pokemon. I do want to increase the chances of drawing Drifloon at the start, but I do think it is good to have these backup Uxies and Azelfs in case our other one gets taken out. So something I would probably think about in this deck, including an X speed or a leaf, just so I can get the right positioning of the Pokemon up front. This would just be something I need to test with for sure. Well, all these Pokemon do have 1 energy retreat cost, cost, so an X speed would work pretty well in this deck. So talking about X speed, let's jump right into our items and our supporters. So generally when I'm thinking about the items in my deck, there are some must-haves and some extras that if I have room for, then I'll include them. Also, some specific decks are going to require specific items. So it's good to kind of think about and test around with, do I need this specific item in this deck? And am I gonna lose momentum, fall behind if I don't have it? So something that goes for default in just about every deck is including 2 Pokeballs and 2 Professor Researches. So first to go over the must-haves is definitely the Professor Research. You should always have 2 of these in every single deck. There's no reason to not have them. This is the best card in the game. I mean, Pocket is pretty small decks. It's only 20 cards. So you want to be drawing through and ramping out as quick as possible. There's only really specific scenarios where I'd say you don't include 2 Pokeballs, and that would be in fossil decks, because in fossil decks you don't draw your fossils with Pokeballs, so there are less Pokemon in your deck that you need a Pokeball for. And generally in specific types of fossil decks, especially ones where you're trying to force draw a Pokemon at the start, like a Skarmory, Bastiodon, or maybe a Regirock in a Rampardos deck, you might only have 1 Pokeball in those decks. This deck is definitely going to need multiple Pokeballs. We have so many basic Pokemon, so each of these Pokemon is hitting a Pokemon for us that is going to be super useful to our game plan. Additionally, a card you should always have is a control card to help you wrap up the game. So that's either Sabrina or Cyrus. They kind of go hand in hand. If you can, I highly recommend having 1 of each or at least 2 of them. So like 2 Cyrus or 2 Sabrina, kind of depends on the deck that you're building. But if you have a deck that's doing damage to their bench Pokemon, it's probably better to have a Cyrus. If you don't, it can be more helpful to have a Sabrina or 1 of each. With this deck, I think Sabrina might be a little bit stronger. I think that she could help potentially early game, and we're really building up to the Mesprit, which is probably going to be able to close out the game for us. So if we can delay the opponent up front, I think that could be helpful for us. If we don't need to use a Sabrina up front, then we can definitely save her for later in the game, which could be helpful as well. There is potentially some talk with Azelf. If you don't know, Azelf does 20 damage to a bench Pokemon, so this could be pretty good pairing with Cyrus. So we might just include both of them in this deck. I think it could be beneficial to have both. And then another thing to think about with items is how you're hitting your draws and if you're hitting them well. So I mean, we already talked about research a little bit. Another great draw card is the communication. I think this card is mostly going to be beneficial for when you're trying to hit a line of Pokemon. So stage 2 Pokemon like Charizard does really well with this, but I think it's pretty good to have 1 of them in your deck if you can. This is just going to help your draws out a little bit more. And then besides that, it's going to really vary depending on the cards and Pokemon you have in your deck, where you're going to need from there. But yeah, we're just thinking about what are our strengths and weaknesses of the Pokemon we have in our deck and how we can use items to help support that. So we'll jump right into the specifics of this particular deck to hopefully give you some ideas about how to handle some other decks. So yeah, I feel like I've already kind of analyzed what I want in this deck. I think Rocky Helmets would be super helpful on both the Driflooms and any of these as well. And I think having X speeds in here would be super helpful. But yeah, here's kind of our initial list. Once we kind of get an initial list together, this is never going to be perfect. We're going to need to bring this into games and start testing it. So I'm going to kind of speed through this next section, but one of the most important things once you've built a deck is testing it rigorously, seeing what's not working and kind of expanding on it a little bit better. Expanding on it. Woo! So yeah, I'll probably speed through the next section, but let's head into some games. So while we jump into the games, the main thing that I'm trying to think about is what are the weaknesses of my deck and how can I improve on it? I'm mainly going to be looking at the losses of my game. And actually with this deck, I didn't get a lot of them. I was doing pretty well right off the start, which doesn't typically happen. I also wasn't facing top of the meta decks, but I was facing some pretty good decks that I've seen around. But when I have a loss, the thing that I'm thinking about first is Did I lose because they had really good draws, or did I lose because of a misplay on my end? If it's not because of one of those reasons, then it's typically going to be something that's weak in the deck. But if they're playing a top of the meta deck and they hit their curve basically perfect, then I'm not really going to count that game or think about that game of how that affected my deck. There's some games that you're just going to lose because they get perfect draws and they have a really good deck that can just capitalize on those draws. So I ended up playing 10 games with this, and I only really ended up having one loss, and it was against a Pachirisu deck. And I learned a couple little things from that matchup. The first is that this deck doesn't ramp out super quickly, so it doesn't need a little bit of time to build up, and it is weak against electric energy. I know I already kind of talked about that, but the Pachirisu matchup is really rough for this deck just because that deck can ramp out super quickly, and it can one-shot all of our Pokemon, including Drifloon, because of our weakness. So something I might think about is potentially having a cape in there for the Drifloon to counter that. But honestly, Pachirisu isn't super prevalent in the meta, so I might not consider making that change just for that reason. When I was playing, I did notice that we do hit our draws pretty well with all the items we have, so we might not need both of the Poke Communications. I think all the rest of our cards kind of support drawing as well, and we have a lot of duplicates, so it is something we could think about dropping one of the Poke Communications for a cape. But honestly, that's a really tough matchup for us, so we do need to hit a pretty good curve for that deck. And yeah, generally I think we would need to completely change this deck if it was like an electric meta or something along those lines. Generally, I think this deck did pretty well though. I got 9 wins out of 10 games, which seems kind of crazy. It might have just been the matchups that I got. I might have just been getting lucky, but overall it felt pretty good. It felt like I was able to go back to my goals of the deck and really capitalize on them. And yeah, typically I'll do a bit more testing with my decks, especially if I'm doing them for a video. I'll probably test for 3 or 4 days up to a week, depending on how powerful I'm trying to get them to be. So yeah, that just about wraps it up. I hope you like content like this. Videos like this take a little bit longer to make than the deck videos, but I think they're super helpful for people, and I've been playing this game for a while, since the pre-launch, so I thought I would share some tips that I've learned along the way. I like keeping a little bit of variety in my videos, but I think I'm going to start trying to have 2 deck videos per week, or if not, then potentially a bigger video like this that has a little bit more work put into it. If you enjoyed content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe, and comment down below. It really helps out the algorithm. Also, 98% of y'all aren't subscribed, so definitely drop a sub if you like cool and interesting decks. We'll be pumping those out over the next couple of weeks. I stream at least twice a week. Usually it'll be 3 times, so come hang out with us. We're usually playing Mondays, and then Thursdays or Fridays, and then one time on the weekend, usually Saturday or Sunday. But yeah, that's just about it. Hope you enjoyed. Catch you later.